Much more on the Ukraine story here on BBC News, and also at 4 o'clock we'll be joining Lyse, Doucet and Matthew Amroliwala for more coverage of the Ukraine situation as those sanctions are brought in. Stay with us for that if you can. You're watching BBC News.
This is a BBC News special on the escalating Ukraine crisis. I'm Matthew Amroliwala in London.
And I'm Lyse Doucet in Kyiv, where Ukrainian declares a state of emergency and calls up reservists to join the regular army in response to what it calls increased Russian aggression. And it gives this warning at the United Nations.
This is an escalating threat to our collective global security and to our freedom. Ukraine expects decisive, immediate and proportional actions by the international community.
Vladimir Putin tells his armed forces the security of Russia is non-negotiable, but he says he's still open to diplomacy.
Joe Biden's assessment and warning couldn't be clearer.
Who in the Lord's name does Putin think gives him the right to declare new so-called countries on territory that belong to his neighbors?
As the West introduces sanctions, the British government faces criticism for not going far enough with its action against Russian billionaires and banks. We'll be live with our correspondents on the Ukrainian border, also live in Washington and live in Paris.
And I'll be speaking to the former Prime Minister of Ukraine. We're also joined by a former NATO Secretary General, senior diplomats and commentators to ask, where is this crisis going from here? Welcome to this BBC News special on the escalating crisis over Ukraine. We're live in Kyiv and London. There have been dramatic developments here in Ukraine today. Ukraine is now set to declare a state of emergency, and at the same time, the Ukrainian authorities have called on their citizens to leave Russia as soon as possible. Doug Lute, thank you very much for joining us with your assessment, former US Ambassador to NATO.
Well, you're watching a BBC News special on the escalating crisis in Ukraine with me, Matthew Amroliwala in London and Lyse Doucet in Kyiv. We're keeping our eyes on the UN, where they're discussing the deteriorating situation as we speak. How does the West respond? What will be Vladimir Putin's next move? In the next half an hour on the programme, we'll get more from our correspondents on the ground, the latest on strategy and the latest too on sanctions.
Well, the whole of Ukraine is expected to come under a state of emergency, except for those two areas which Russia recognises as independent. There's going to be new measures to control transport, new forces on the street. People's lives will not be affected.
Anna Applebaum, thanks for being so brief and thanks for joining us here on the programme.
And you've been watching this BBC News special on the escalating crisis in Ukraine, live in Kyiv or London, at a time when here in Kyiv, the Ukrainian Parliament has been meeting in special session to discuss the imposition of a state of emergency at the same time as reservists have been called up.
Yes, we've heard from the UN Secretary-General in the last couple of hours talking about this being such a pivotal moment for the whole of the world. Ukraine's foreign minister also urging for action now from the international community. Do stay with us on BBC News for continuing coverage of this developing crisis. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye. This is BBC World News. I'm Matthew Amroliwala. On today's Global, Ukraine declares a state of emergency and calls up reservists to join the regular army in response to what it calls increased Russian aggression, and gives this warning at the UN.
This is an escalating threat to our collective global security and to our freedom. Ukraine expects decisive, immediate and proportional actions by the international community.
Vladimir Putin tells his armed forces the security of Russia is non-negotiable, but claimed he is still open to diplomacy. In the past hour, Ukrainian state websites have been targeted in what the government is calling a large-scale cyber attack. As the West introduces sanctions, the British government faces criticisms for not going far enough with its action against Russian billionaires and banks. Well, we'll hear the latest from our correspondents in the region and hear the views of a former Ukrainian Prime Minister and a former NATO Secretary General. That's coming up here on today's Global. Welcome to today's Global. Ukraine is set to declare a state of emergency and has urged its citizens to leave Russia in response to President Putin's decision to recognise the independence of two breakaway regions.